My name is John Litell, and I will be reading to you from my translation of Andrea Lundgren's Nordisk Fauna, originally published in Swedish and published in translation by Peirene Press. It's a collection of short stories. I'll be reading from How Things Come to Seem, and like the rest, they are infused with the spirit of northern Sweden and with an element of magical realism, which makes them just spooky enough and makes it just challenging enough to know whose perspective one's hearing from at any given time. It was a delight to translate and read. She saw herself at the far end of the carriage, had a vision of herself from outside, as if another version of her stood in the forest, watching herself walking there, back and forth through the empty train. 11 years old, the long, straggly hair. It smelled fresh out there. The moss had crept up onto the stones and turned them green. Linnea flowers and heather grew in the crevices. Her counterpart inside the train had paused, resting her hands on the backs of the seats on either side of the aisle, feeling the coarse blue fabric against her palms. 2 rows ahead lay her rumpled bag, collapsed into itself. She looked out of the window, and behind the translucent mirror image of the train's interior she saw nothing. Not herself out there, just her reflected self standing here in the aisle. Pale face, dark eyes, the round cheeks. She passed her seat, and soon she felt the brisk night air flowing towards her. The heavy sliding door at the end of the train was open, and the forest leaned in towards it, just outside. Goose pimples spread across her arms in the draft. At the bottom of the steps she saw the gravel. Hard to say if anyone had walked there. It was uneven. She went out onto the narrow steps. The air didn't seem completely clear. It was as if she couldn't see as far as she'd like. The gravel crunched when she stepped on it. She gripped the railing with one hand as if to reassure herself that the train wouldn't take off without her, that she wouldn't be left there without her phone. Should have grabbed my jacket, she thought. There was a chill in the air, but she didn't feel cold. It felt clean in her lungs, the way forest air often does. The trunks of the pine trees looked damp. No bird song, no insect sounds, just this stillness between the dark trunks with their coarse, twisted branches. This was an ancient forest, not the cultivated, monotonous, basic kind you mostly saw along the tracks. This was something different. From what she'd read, you identified really old pine trees not by their height, but by their bark and the branches, which would have begun growing back upon themselves. For most of their lives, they were on their way outward, getting longer, taller. Then came a transition, an insight. Turn back and protect. Twist around yourself. They suddenly became so human, shrunk in height every year that the branches slowly struggled to find their way back toward the body. She looked in both directions. A bird called out from somewhere, a melodic and pretty sound. 3 times, then silence again. The train didn't emit a noise, not a creak or anything, as if it had been standing there for a long time, months even, several years, become overgrown, let nature force itself in, let moss cover the roof. The moon shone overhead, a pale sliver, shrunken by distance. Her gaze swept across the forest again, and then she saw something, practically right in front of her, but a bit further in. She focused her vision, blinking to clear the sleep from her eyes. It was an animal sitting there, a fox, more gray than red in the dusk, looking right at her. She felt her heart begin to pound. Lill Mikkel, Gullfot, Rödbyxa. She murmured the names of foxes from her childhood, almost soundlessly to herself. It was perched on a stone, tail hanging to one side. She could see its ears moving slightly. It was so oddly still. She waved her hand a little, not really sure why, as if it would also move just because she did. It did not, and she didn't want it to approach. Despite its small size, it was a wild animal, and she respected wild animals. Since the fox stayed motionless, she felt brave enough to have a look around again. She was suddenly worried that she would miss the conductor if they came walking through the train. But surely she would hear them. It was right behind her, after all. That said, the silence out here was deafening, drowned out all sound from within, if there was any. It had made its way into the train as well, woken people and got them to walk out. She had slept the deepest, awoken last. Meanwhile, a small crowd of people had gathered outside, maybe even right where she now stood. The conductor had felt compelled to say something, point out a bearing. Someone had yawned, someone else stretched, a child clutched a toy horse. The two hikers, a man and a woman, had their rucksacks on. The woman said something to the man and made a sweeping gesture with her arm. Away. They seemed eager to get moving, and after having sat still for so long, she thought she heard them speaking German. Her head snapped quickly back to the place where the fox had been sitting. It was no longer there. A shiver ran through her legs, and she scanned the ground nearest her, as if the fox was just about to creep over and sink its teeth into her thigh or her foot. She even bent down, got on all fours, and looked under the train. She saw the dark water on the other side, but no fox, no people, just the night forest, and her. She abruptly got to her feet. A sound expanded within her, starting near her stomach, a low wail, locked within a dark room. It wound its way farther up her throat, and she opened her mouth. As she inhaled, her whole mouth cooled, and along with the air came something else, a silence. It slid slowly into her and laid itself to rest. She thought about her luggage still inside the train, but she didn't need it anymore. Her bearing suddenly became clear, like when a pure tone grows stronger and resonates within the body. She descended the stony embankment, and the sound of her footsteps was swallowed by the soft moss as she began to walk.